Hello everyone and welcome to episode 15 of the History Hotline. Today we will be talking about the life of Leroy Logan, who was a black police officer in the 1980s in Britain. And if you're anything like me, you may have just watched or watched yesterday or a few days ago, depending on when you're listening, the third instalment of Steve McQueen's Small Axe series of feature-length films that have been on the BBC and available also on Amazon Prime. And the episode Red, White and Blue aired on Sunday the 29th of November, and it was about the life of Leroy Logan. So I thought we'd give that episode a little bit more context today and pick out some of the main points that came up in that episode and some of the key elements and I think things that were quite noticeable that are themes that run through Black British history, especially when it comes to policing. That were quite interesting to see kind of portrayed in the short film that I have just watched. So my plan for this episode today is to look at the life of Leroy Logan and the context of policing in London at the time, to also look at the family's reaction to his decision to join the police force and the community reaction, which I think is highlighted really well in the mini-film. And then also his achievements after, what was shown and portrayed by Steve McQueen's film, and then the kind of aftermath of the story and who Leroy Logan is today, what he does, and, the little odds and ends that have made his life what it is. So, first of all, Leroy Logan was born in Islington in North London. He was the eldest child of parents who arrived from Jamaica, and so that would make them part of the Winners generation. So people we are familiar with in regards to that kind of migration pattern and their story. His dad arrived in 1954 and then sent for his mom. His mom came to England. After 5 years, she actually went back to Jamaica and took Leroy and his sister Hyacinth, who was only a few months old at the time, with her. And so Leroy grew up, he spent 3 years in Spanish Town. Having been born in England, he'd gone to Jamaica. His mom had gone back, bringing him with her. And a point he made, and he has a book that has recently come out, and his book is called My Life as a Cop. And it came out, I think, earlier this year. I haven't had the chance to read it yet. I do want to. And so forgive me, if I say anything that I should know. Maybe you've read the book already and you're listening to this after. And you probably have more answers than me at this current stage in my research. But one thing I did find interesting is that in Leroy Logan's experience living in Jamaica, in Spanish Town near Kingston, he said he saw black politicians, black police officers, black doctors in Jamaica, and he had a very different mindset than maybe someone that was Jamaican or of Jamaican descent and grew up in Britain. You wouldn't see black people represented in forms of authority or in high spaces or well-paying jobs, apart from the token odd person, especially in the early waves of migration in the 50s and the early 60s. And so he's kind of had this difference. A black police officer is not alien to him, neither is a black doctor or a black politician, because that's his reality in Jamaica. And it is really interesting, actually, because it's something I always notice when I'm in Jamaica or when I've come back. Like, it kind of hits you that you don't have to think about your race while you're there, because everybody essentially looks like you. And whilst obviously, you're still conscious of yourself in other ways, race isn't something you think about so much. And I will say that the burden that can have, especially when you can contrast it with not having to think about race constantly, the burden that can have then on you in Britain, living in Britain as a black person, it is very noticeable and it is quite heavy at times. And so I thought that was quite interesting, something that he thought and he pointed out from his experiences growing up as a child and not necessarily going through the British education system from an early age. In primary school he was still in Jamaica, so he wouldn't have gone through that in England. So Leroy Logan is brought back to England and he goes through education and he becomes a scientist, and his kind of decision is if he's going to go into medicine. I think there was a point in the film where it's kind of said, oh, you know, you're meant to be a doctor next. He's working in a lab as a scientist, thinking about going into something scientific essentially. However, he ends up as a police officer, and you're probably thinking, well, how did that happen? So essentially, I think there were a series of events that led up to Logan deciding to become a police officer. One of them he speaks about is seeing a black police officer in his patrol car and walking past him, and also the two men that he meets at the gym that he goes to, which is like the racetrack that he runs on, and you know, him getting chatting to them, and then him figuring out that they're actually off-duty police officers. His boss at his laboratory said and commented that, you know, he had quite an outgoing character, which is quite clear actually in the depiction of him by John Boyega, who did a fantastic job, I will say. And yeah, so he was asked by his Professor Roy Pounder, you know, if he'd ever thought of the police, because a life in a lab would be something, you know, quite dull for such an outgoing character essentially. And Logan apparently said, do I look like a white racist? And I think that literally perfectly sums up and highlights exactly the perception of the police at the time. Like, they were just known as racists, you know, walking around in their bully vans, terrorising people, especially black people. You know, if we go back to the Mangrove 9, I feel like I say it every episode, but that was the key, I think, example of that. But we have to remember, whilst the Mangrove 9 happened and we know about it, I can probably imagine that there were tens, if not hundreds more Mangrove 9s that happened that we don't know about, that their stories haven't been recorded, or, you know, they haven't had a mini film about what happened to them, and their cases didn't go to court in the same way. But those antics of the police intimidating and bullying black people, not just in their businesses or in their homes, but on the streets with stop and searches and the sus laws that were a thing, especially in the 80s, and especially targeting young black men. They were all very, very much to have an impact on black people and black men's decision to join the police force, especially as early as the 80s. Now, there was already a black police officer. Obviously, we've said Logan had spotted one, and there have been black police officers in the Met. I think the earliest one was in 1967, and he's a man called Norwell Roberts. He's the first black police officer in the Metropolitan Police. So in an interview with the BBC earlier this week, Leroy Logan said that at the time, when, you know, he was a research scientist and debating joining the force, he just kept thinking, there's like no way I'll leave the world of science. I'll be going against my father. His father wanted him to be a scientist, and that's exactly what he was doing. And he just felt like the call, he said, was just constantly nagging him. And just kind of, he just felt there were just so many signs that were pointing him towards policing. And, you know, obviously you might be thinking, what a crazy man. Like, why would you do that? Like, why would you ever want to put yourself in a position where you are essentially donning a uniform that upholds so many things that threaten your life in regards to institutional racism, you know, police brutality, the way that police are treating black people at the time. It's crazy to me. But then also, which I think the film did really do really well, in the way that they explored Leroy Logan's motivations for being in the force and for wanting to make a positive change from within, because his argument essentially was, you know, it's all well and good talking about how bad the force is and how, it needs to change. But sometimes you actually just have to work within to change it. And that's essentially what he tried to do. Now, this is where the story goes a bit, it just gets a bit sticky. So in 1983, whilst working at a research lab, Leroy Logan receives a call, and his father, Kenneth, who wanted him to be a scientist, was happy that that's what he was doing, was beaten up by the police. He was parked up on, like, kind of, I think it was a street, but apparently it was blocking a highway. But his dad was adamant that he wasn't. He took out his tape measure and literally measured and had clearly been following the code, that he was not blocking the highway. It was in the vicinity and presence of eyewitnesses who saw the police, came up to him, approached him, did not like his attitude, essentially. Some would say he failed the attitude test that he probably didn't even know he was taking, and the police beat him up. When his son went to visit him in the hospital, when he heard the news while he was at work, he couldn't even notice him. He walked straight past him. He was that badly beaten and bruised. His face was completely battered from the beating. He had 2 black eyes. And, to make matters worse and add insult to injury, he also faced charges of obstruction and resisting arrest, which is just so interesting because it's just the same the same charges that they apply to protesters or to more generally black people that they feel like, quote unquote, fail the attitude test or aren't acting in a way that the police would like them to. And so this was a context in which Leroy Logan was to become a police officer, his personal life context. You might be thinking, well, after that incident, why would you then still decide to go through with a policing application? So he'd put in an application prior to that incident with his dad, and then obviously, his application had been processed and gone through, and by the time that had happened, and in the aftermath of the incidents of police brutality with his father, he is offered a spot on the force to train. And unfortunately, his dad finds out by the police visiting his house, because they came to just check that his address was correct and to verify his address. Dad shared the sentiments of black people, some black people at the time, that would say, if you are a black person becoming a police officer, you're a bit of a sellout to the black race, to the black community, because of what the police were doing to black people. And obviously, having gone through what he had gone through only weeks prior, he must have been completely outraged, shell-shocked, confused as to why his son was going to decide, of all the things to do, when he's clearly on a great trajectory into being a research scientist and getting into medicine. He's decided to be a police officer. I think his dad hung up on him when he spoke to him on the phone, and his family didn't really understand why this was what he was choosing to do. And so Logan, he gets into the police force eventually, and is a police officer, and there is obviously pushback from his family, especially his dad. His dad's case is dropped. He doesn't get his day in court as he wanted to, which is made clear in the film's depiction of it. The charges are dropped probably because Leroy Logan makes a very good impression when he joins the police force, and becomes in some ways the face of the force in regards to their drive to increase the numbers of black police officers. And so with the work that he's doing there, I think he's able to, without actually asking or even mentioning it, although the police officers do know what has happened with his dad only months or weeks prior, that case is dropped and the charges are dropped. And so Leroy Logan's career in the police force is about a 30-year one. So he does stick it out and one thing about the film, if you haven't seen it, it does kind of stop at a point very early on in his career, so it's quite difficult to know what kind of comes next. And I think that's what we'll talk about in a little bit more depth here, because I don't know, I would argue that the best was left out. Some of the work that Leroy Logan went on to do was absolutely incredible, and I felt like this is not necessarily a critique of the film, because it could only be a certain amount of time, and I think it highlighted some really key points of institutional racism, of the culture of policing, and the way white police officers, treated new recruits that were black or Asian especially. And I think that is definitely portrayed very well and very clearly by the short film. However, that's not all there is to this story. And I would like to say and to note that Leroy Logan, he did, climb through the ranks, obviously facing overt, covert levels of racism, discrimination, microaggressions, physical abuse. His officers that were meant to be supporting him didn't back him up on arrests. He was beaten up by criminals, by people that he was trying to arrest, and didn't have the backup. And that was just kind of one case that was portrayed in the film. And I don't want to detract from all that, but I would obviously suggest, if you haven't watched it, to watch it. This episode will make a little bit more sense, but you don't have to. You can still keep listening, because I'm going to talk about the bits that the film kind of left out and the things that he achieved despite the adversity he faced in the force. And so, as I said, he rose up the ranks. He retired as a superintendent in 2013. So he became an officer in 1983, and by 2013 he became a superintendent. He also contributed to the Damilola Taylor inquiry, and if you don't know about that, then Damilola Taylor was a 10-year-old boy who was murdered by two young men in London in 2000. He was only 10 years old. He was on his way back from the library, and he was stabbed in the leg and left to die in a stairway on his way home. And Leroy Logan was one of the people that contributed to the Damilola Taylor inquiry, which looked at the way the police had handled the murder and the failings that they had made in regards to forensic information, and also in regards to, I think, keeping the records of, and the forensic records of, people that should have been kept on a database that would have made it easier to identify the perpetrators of this crime, but they had not done that. And also he worked on fighting knife crime in London, and also worked in the Met during the 2012 London Olympics, and the kind of policing of that event. And he also was one of the officers that escorted Princess Diana around during her visit to the Cadet Corps, which he helped to found. And I think he speaks more about that in his book, actually. So I would definitely, if you want to know more about that interaction, a whole Princess Diana was escorted by Leroy Logan. I found it interesting that wasn't in the short film. I think it would have been great. I think the contrast with, him being responsible for a royal and her treatment whilst taking a tour of the police cadet corps, and him kind of starting out dealing with all this racial prejudice and discrimination from people that are meant to protect and serve him also, and work alongside him so he can do that. That contrast, I think, would have been really nice to see. Also, and probably most notably, he did many notable things, as you can gather. He was elected the first chair of the National Black Police Association. Throughout his time in the force, he was consistently undermined by rumours and lies spread about him, and just elements of overt racism against him. And essentially, he was promoted to chief inspector, and as I said, he was chair of the MBPA. And then he kind of heard rumours of an investigation. He was served with a disciplinary notice claiming that he had defrauded the Home Office out of £80 in his role in the NBPA. And imagine, his defence team, when this all went to tribunal, was leading civil rights lawyer Sadiq Khan. Who knew? I did not know that Sadiq Khan did anything outside of politics before being London Mayor, let alone being a civil rights lawyer. And so he was his defence. Like, that is absolutely insane to me. And I've seen pictures of Leroy Logan and Sadiq Khan, but I didn't know that this was the context of why they know each other. In the end, after a process of long and grueling interviews, he was judged to have no case to answer. But Leroy Logan was like, no, this isn't the end of this, because this is clearly a case of, racism within the force. And he took the Met to an employment tribunal whilst working at the Met. The Met is paying him. He's on their payroll. He said, you will not go down without being publicly shamed. And he secured a settlement for himself, and also a review of other outstanding tribunal and civil court cases that were also being pursued by black officers. So not only did he help himself in that situation and get justice for himself, he also opened the door to do that for others. We often, see cases of people making it out of marginalised communities into positions of power and forgetting to reach back down to help those that are also trying to work their way up these ladders. And he does exactly that, and there are so many instances in his career of him doing that, and I'm so annoyed that this show didn't go further into his career and into his life. And I understand that it would have been hours and hours long, because this man has lived a life, and that is definitely undeniable. However, there were so many things that I just wanted to see on screen that I didn't get to see, which is a bit upsetting. Steve McQueen, I'm sorry. I do love you. So in interviews with different journalists and in his book, Leroy Logan speaks a lot about policing today and policing, especially with young people, and the relationship that the police have with young people, not just black young people but other young people. And he said, which I think was quite interesting, I see a real hatred for police officers again. I am shocked by the things young people say to me about the police and the level of violence towards police officers. So many things we've achieved are being eroded in terms of working with communities and involving them in how they are policed, and our black officers are stuck in the middle of that. And I think I would agree. What do I know about the police? But my small research, I would also agree with his point. I think that after the murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993 and the report that followed, the Macpherson report, which declared the London Metropolitan Police as institutionally racist, and then all the kind of initiatives and action that kind of came in as a result of that ruling, that created a lot of change. And I think in the result of that, and in the aftermath of that, those changes have slowly been reversed. I wouldn't necessarily blame it on any specific government, but there has been one specific government in power for the past 10 years. And the way in which they have allowed, I think, police to hold themselves accountable, as opposed to, them as the government holding police accountable for the things that they do. It's clear, because relationships between communities and the police are deteriorating, and I think it's very clear to see when you've got certain issues such as knife crime, that the police are struggling to fight because of, I'd say, a lack of cohesion with the communities that they're serving. And that's enough of me and my political analysis of the week. So back to Leroy Logan and his life. He was given an MBE in the year 2000. Unfortunately, his parents passed away in 2000 and 2001. But when he went to collect this honour, his father, Kenneth Logan, he leaned over and said to him, I suppose you did the right thing joining the police. And I just think that is in some ways quite beautiful. And I wish... I'm not a director either. I'm giving my 2 cents where people probably don't even want to hear my 2 cents. But that would have been a really nice way to end the show, maybe. I don't know, because that kind of tension with him and his father was not really resolved in the show. You don't really get to find out what he thinks about that. And whilst I can imagine and understand that resentment he must feel throughout his life, essentially, because of the horrific experience he had with the police, and this is Leroy's dad, Leroy Logan's father, I understand at the point, in 2000, his father in some ways makes peace with his decision and his choice to embark upon this journey of becoming a police officer. And the things he achieved in his career are remarkable for anyone, let alone a black man that was facing the institutional racism that he was facing, the overt racism from his colleagues, from the superiors, from the people he was policing, and the backlash from black people, which I think was very, very clear in the show, which portrayed wonderfully and very accurately, because he was called a Judas, he was called a traitor, he was called a sellout, he was called all these things, and he's still, you know, in some ways managed to achieve so much. And you might be thinking, well, you know what, the police is still institutionally racist now, it's still disproportionately stop and searching black people are still being terrorized and brutalized by the police in this country, and you'd be absolutely right to say that. And maybe we could ask a question, if there were, I don't know, like hundreds or thousands of Leroy Logans, maybe would things have changed? Would more black police officers have been the solution? I mean, I doubt it, because as we know, representation is not the only key. However, the things that he achieved, I think, were slightly underplayed by that narrative in small acts this week. However, I thoroughly enjoyed the series so far, and I hope that the next two, I think, are also great, and it's just nice, I think, to have these stories told in a mainstream place and on a mainstream channel, that is BBC One. And so, yeah, props to all the actors, to Steve McQueen, and they are my points for the show, for Leroy Logan's life. I think we've unpacked a lot today. There's been quite the mix. So if you haven't already watched that episode, I think you should. And if not, if you've already watched it, then you're 2 steps ahead of the game. Have a wonderful week. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.